In 1954, a 4-year-old Clint Eastwood was broke, sleeping in his car, and taking acting classes he could barely afford when a movie theater security guard named Frank Chen let him sleep in the back row overnight instead of kicking him out at closing time. What happened in that theater over the course of one cold November night, and what Clint did 38 years later when he found Frank again, became one of those stories about small kindnesses that compound over decades, something extraordinary. Clint had come to Los Angeles in late 1954 after being discharged from the Army. He had no plan beyond try to be an actor and about $300 in savings. He'd found a cheap room in a boarding house, started taking acting classes, and began showing up to every audition he could find. The money ran out faster than he'd expected. Los Angeles was expensive. The acting classes were $15 a week. Food, gas for his beat-up car, the boarding house room, it all added up faster than the occasional day labor jobs could cover. By November, Clint was sleeping in his car most nights to save money. It wasn't comfortable, but it was November in Los Angeles, cold at night, but not freezing. He could manage. The Rialto Theater was an old movie palace on Broadway in downtown L.A. Built in the 1920s, it had once been grand, but by the 1950s, it was showing second-run films and barely staying open. The tickets were cheap, 50 cents for a double feature, which made it popular with people who didn't have much money. Clint would go there sometimes when he had 50 cents to spare and needed to get warm. You could sit through 2 movies, maybe 3 if you stayed quiet and the staff didn't notice, and it was warm inside. Frank Chen was the night security guard. He was in his early 60s, Chinese immigrant who'd come to California in the 1920s, worked various jobs, ended up as night security at the Rialto. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady, and Frank took it seriously. His job was simple: watch the theater during the evening shows, make sure there were no problems, and at closing time, make sure everyone left so he could lock up. On a Tuesday night in mid-November 1954, Clint bought a ticket to see whatever was playing. He didn't care about the movie. He cared about being warm for a few hours. The theater was nearly empty, maybe 20 people scattered across 800 seats. Clint sat in the back row. The movies played. Other people left. Clint stayed, slouched in his seat, trying to be invisible. The second movie ended around 10:30 p.m. The lights came up. Frank Chen started his closing rounds, politely telling the few remaining people that the theater was closing. He got to the back row and found Clint, still sitting there, clearly not in a hurry to leave. "Theater's closed," Frank said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. Clint stood up slowly. "Yeah, I know. Just heading out." Frank watched him gather his jacket, thin, not warm enough for the November nights, and start toward the exit. Something about the way the young man moved, the reluctance to leave the warm building, made Frank pay attention. He'd been working at the Rialto for 5 years. He'd seen plenty of people trying to stay warm, trying to stretch 50 cents into as many hours of shelter as possible. "You got somewhere to go?" Frank asked. Clint stopped, turned around. For a moment, he considered lying, but there was something about Frank's face, not pity, just straightforward concern, that made him tell the truth. "Car," Clint said. "I'm sleeping in my car." Frank nodded. He'd figured as much. "How long?" "Couple weeks." "It's fine. Not that cold yet. It's 40 degrees tonight, supposed to drop to 35. Clint shrugged. "I've been colder." Frank stood there for a moment, thinking. Then he made a decision that would ripple forward for decades. "Back row," he said, gesturing to where Clint had been sitting. "You can sleep there tonight. I'll wake you up before the morning manager comes in at 6 a.m., but you have to be gone by then, and you can't tell anyone about this." Clint stared at him. "Seriously?" Seriously, but if you get caught, I never saw you. Understand? Why would you do this? Frank's answer was simple. Because it's cold outside and warm in here, and I've got 800 empty seats. Doesn't make sense for you to freeze when there's a warm place you could sleep. That night, Clint slept in the back row of the Rialto Theater. It was the best sleep he'd had in 2 weeks, warm, dry, horizontal, instead of cramped in a car seat. The theater was completely silent except for the building settling, the occasional creak of old wood and plaster. The velvet seat reclined enough that he could stretch out. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and old carpet. For the first time in weeks, Clint felt safe. Not just physically warm, but safe in the way that matters when you're young and broke and starting to wonder if you've made a terrible mistake coming to Los Angeles. At 5:45 a.m., Frank woke him up gently, touching his shoulder. Manager comes in at 6. You need to go. Clint sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where he was. Clint grabbed his jacket. Thank you, really. Don't come back for a few days. Too suspicious if the same guy keeps being the last one here. How will I? Thursday nights, Frank said. Thursday's the slowest night. Come in around 9, sit in the back, stay after closing. I'll let you stay until morning, but only Thursdays and only if you're careful. For the next 3 months, every Thursday night, Clint would buy a 50-cent ticket to the Rialto, sit through the movies, and stay after closing. Frank would do his closing rounds, walk past the back row without looking too closely, miss seeing Clint slouched in his seat, then lock up the theater and leave Clint to sleep in the warmth until 5:45 a.m. It became a ritual. Clint would arrive around 9 p.m. Frank would give him a small nod of acknowledgement, never more than that, in case other staff were watching. Clint would sit through whatever double feature was playing, sometimes paying attention, sometimes just dozing through the films to save his energy for the night ahead. When the lights came up at closing and other patrons filed out, Clint would shift in his seat to look like he'd fallen asleep during the movie. Frank would wake other drowsy patrons but walk right past Clint. After everyone else left and the building was locked, Clint would have the entire 800-seat theater to himself. They'd talk sometimes before Frank left for the night. Clint told him about trying to make it as an actor, about the auditions that went nowhere, about the acting classes he was barely affording. Frank told him about coming to America in 1923, about working in restaurants and laundries, about the discrimination that kept Chinese immigrants locked out of most jobs, about ending up as a security guard in his 60S instead of the business owner he'd hoped to become. You think you'll make it? Frank asked one night. As an actor? I don't know, Clint said honestly. Maybe not. But I'm going to find out. That's all anyone can do. Find out. In February 1955, Clint got a contract with Universal Studios, $40 a week. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rent a cheap apartment. He didn't need to sleep in the theater anymore. The last Thursday before he moved into his apartment, Clint went to the Rialto one more time. He found Frank before the evening show started. I got a studio contract, Clint said. I can afford a place now. I won't need to stay here anymore. Frank smiled. That's good. I'm glad for you. Clint pulled out $20, half a week's salary. I want to pay you back for all the nights. Frank refused. You don't owe me anything. I gave you warm seats that would have been empty anyway. Cost me nothing. It cost you your job if you'd been caught. But I wasn't caught, so it cost me nothing. They shook hands. Clint left. They never saw each other again. Clint's career took off slowly, then dramatically. TV series, movies, stardom, directing. By the 1990s, he was one of the most successful filmmakers in Hollywood. The Rialto Theater closed in 1978. Unable to compete with multiplexes, it sat empty for years, then became a discount store, then sat empty again. By 1992, it was a boarded up relic of old Los Angeles, scheduled for demolition. In early 1992, Clint read a Los Angeles Times article about the demolition of old Broadway theaters. The Rialto was mentioned. The article noted that preservationists wanted to save it but couldn't find funding. Clint remembered the theater, remembered sleeping in the back row, remembered Frank Chen. He called his assistant. Find out who owns the Rialto Theater building. I want to buy it. The building was owned by a developer who planned to demolish it and build a parking structure. Clint bought it for $800,000, which was probably twice what it was worth as a teardown. Then he called a friend who specialized in historic preservation. I want to restore this theater. Original condition, whatever it costs. The restoration took 2 years and cost $4.2 million. When it was done, the Rialto looked like it had in 1925, ornate ceiling, velvet seats, original architectural details restored. But before opening it to the public, Clint had his assistant track down Frank Chen. It took 3 months. Frank had left the Rialto when it closed in 1978. He'd worked a few other security jobs, then retired in the mid-1980s. In 1992, he was 87 years old, living in a small apartment in Monterey Park, surviving on Social Security. Clint's assistant called Frank and said that Clint Eastwood wanted to see him. Frank thought it was a scam. Why would Clint Eastwood want to see me? He says you knew each other in 1954. He says you helped him when he needed it. Frank was quiet for a long moment, remembering the kid who slept in the theater. Can you meet him next Saturday at the Rialto Theater on Broadway? Frank hadn't been to Broadway in 15 years. He took 2 buses to get there, arrived at the address, and found the Rialto restored to its former glory. He stood outside, confused, wondering if he had the wrong building. A man approached him. Frank recognized him immediately, despite 38 years. Clint Eastwood, older but unmistakably the same person who'd slept in the back row. Frank, Clint said, extending his hand. Frank shook it, still confused. What is this? I want to show you something. Come inside. They walked into the restored theater. Frank stopped just inside the doors, taking in the restored grandeur. The ornate ceiling he'd walked under thousands of times during his rounds, now cleaned and restored, the original gold leaf gleaming. The velvet seats, which had been threadbare and stained when he'd worked there, now looked like they had in the 1920s. The original chandeliers that had been removed in the 1960s had been replicated and rehung. Frank walked slowly down the center aisle, his hand trailing along the seat backs. He'd walked this aisle thousands of times, checking for sleeping patrons, looking for people who'd snuck in without tickets, making sure everyone left at closing time. You remember this place? Clint asked, walking beside him. Of course I remember it. I worked here 14 years. Frank's voice was thick with emotion. But it never looked like this. Not in my time. This is how it must have looked when it first opened. You remember letting a broke kid sleep here in 1954? Frank smiled slightly. I remember. You were freezing in your car. Didn't make sense when there were empty seats. Clint gestured around the theater. I bought this building, restored it, and I'm giving it to you. Frank stared at him. Your what? The building is in your name. I've set up a trust that covers all property taxes and maintenance for the rest of your life. When you're gone, it transfers to a nonprofit that will run it as a community theater. But while you're alive, it's yours. Frank couldn't speak. He stood in the middle of the theater he'd worked in for 14 years, being told that it now belonged to him. Why? He finally asked. Because in 1954, you risked your job to let a broke kid sleep somewhere warm. You didn't have to do that. You did it anyway. That kindness mattered. It might have been the thing that kept me going during the hardest months. I just let you sleep in empty seats. You gave me dignity when I had nothing. You didn't make me beg. You didn't make me feel like a charity case. You just said it's warm in here. Doesn't make sense for you to freeze. That's a gift. Frank sat down in one of the restored velvet seats, the same seats he used to check during his closing rounds. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just accept it. The Rialto Theater reopened in 1994 as a community theater and cultural center. Frank Chen, at 89, was listed as the owner. He attended every opening night, sitting in the back row where Clint used to sleep. People who worked at the theater during those years remember Frank as a quiet presence who took his role seriously. He'd arrive early for screenings, walk the aisles before the show started, make sure everything was in order. Old habits from his security guard days. When people asked him how he came to own such a beautiful theater, he'd tell them the story about the broke young actor sleeping in his car, about Thursday nights, about a small kindness that cost nothing, about 38 years later receiving a palace in return. I never expected anything, he'd say. That's not why I did it. But that's the point, isn't it? You don't do kindness for reward. You do it because it's right. The theater showed classic films, hosted community events, and became a gathering place for the neighborhood. Frank lived 4 more years until 1998, attending the theater regularly until a few months before his death. In his will, he left a letter to be read at his funeral. Part of it said, "In 1954, I let a young man sleep in a warm theater instead of a cold car. It cost me nothing. The seats would have been empty anyway. I never expected anything in return. 38 years later, that young man gave me a palace. He didn't have to do that. But he did it because he remembered a small kindness. This taught me that nothing we do for others is ever wasted. Even the smallest gesture, especially the smallest gesture, can ripple forward in ways we can't predict." When Frank died, the theater transferred to a nonprofit foundation exactly as Clint had set up. It's still operating today, showing films, hosting events, serving the community. There's a small plaque in the lobby dedicated to Frank Chen, who understood that kindness costs nothing but means everything. Here's what that November night in 1954 teaches us. Frank Chen gave up nothing of value to help Clint. The seats would have been empty anyway. The theater would have been warm whether Clint was there or not. Frank risked his job but gained nothing material. He did it simply because it was the right thing to do, because it didn't make sense for someone to freeze when there was warmth available. Clint could have forgotten. 38 years is a long time. Frank was a security guard who let him sleep in a theater a few times. Most people wouldn't remember, wouldn't feel obligated, but Clint did remember. And when he had the resources to turn a small kindness into a grand gesture, he did it. That's the lesson. The small kindnesses we offer cost us almost nothing, but can mean everything to the person receiving them. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes those small kindnesses come back to us in ways we never imagined. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that no act of kindness is ever wasted, even when it seems small, even when no one's watching.